Okay, going back to what makes a photo interesting. If you take tons and tons of photos, and I recommend that when you find something interesting, you take as many photos of it as you possibly can. Part of what can make an interesting photo is that you either have really impeccable timing or you get lucky or both. And so the more photos you take, the higher chance you have of getting a good one. So take lots and lots and lots. And for these assignments, I'm serious when I say that you should probably take hundreds, if not thousands of photos for these assignments and handpick the ones that are the best. Because here I can tell you that I probably took a whole bunch of photos and none of them were that interesting except this one. This one just happened to be, I think, the best overall combination of everything, and I think it made, in the end, a reasonably successful photo. So, keepers. So you do need to make sure that you take a lot of photos, and out of that you will have a subset of them that are good to keep, and we call those in the photographic world keepers. And in fact, you guys know what chimping is? Ever heard of this? Okay. So, and I know all of you have done this. If you've touched a digital camera, you take a photo and you look at it and you go, ooh, ooh, ooh. Like that. That is chimping, okay? So don't go overboard with the chimping, please, especially in public. I laugh every time I see it. And in fact, I think one of the things that I recommend doing is that you turn off the screen, especially on an SLR. They usually will show you the photo that you just took for a second or two after you took it. Turn that off. Don't waste the battery. Just keep taking photos and then review the photos later, because I guarantee that how the photo looks on your camera is not going to look the same as when you bring it on your computer screen. It's going to, when it's on the bigger screen, you're going to say, oh, that looks a lot worse than I thought it did on the camera. So keep shooting. Well, you should review. The screen is very useful. You should review it, but I'm just saying as a general rule, don't chimp too much. I think if you have not seen it also, I feel like I'm going over everything that I'm going to be talking about this semester. I'm not going to have anything else to talk about, but don't worry, I always find something. But if you want to see interesting photos, go to boston.com's The Big Picture. Just Google for it and find it. I don't have the best internet connection in here, but every week or every couple of days they have really large, really excellent pictures about some topic, and they're always extremely moving, I think. A lot of the photos, so as you know, Senator Ted Kennedy recently passed away, and so they did a big picture about him. And so right now, in this case, there's only one, but they have other, oh boy, I don't know if I can find it now, but they do have other big pictures that are, equally or even more, perhaps, incredible than this. So let's see. Oh, yes. So this one here, for example, ballots, bullets, and bombs in Afghanistan. They run a series of photos from Afghanistan. You'll notice that it says there's 43 photos here, and all of them are really interesting. And in fact, there's one photo that's extremely moving of an AP photographer that was nearby when a car bomb blast went off, and he unfortunately lost his foot, but on a gurney he was still taking photos, and there's a photo of him on a gurney still taking photos, and it's incredible. It's just an incredible picture, and I really recommend this website, not only to see interesting photos, but to look at the style and see how people are taking these photos. And this stuff, no matter how good of a photographer you get, you should never become so cocky as to look at a photo that's something like this and say that it's imperfect or that it's bad, because there may be imperfections, but it conveys something, and that is what these photos are meant to do, I think. So without, we could spend lectures talking about the photos at the big picture, but instead I'll leave that as an assignment for home. Now, one of the very basic rules of composition in photography in terms of how to position everything in your frame is something called the rule of thirds. I'm going to say this right now. Stop centering everything in the middle of your frame, please. That means somebody's big goofy face right in the middle of the frame that's overexposed is not going to be very interesting of a photograph. But that same person that's slightly overexposed and moved off center, all of a sudden it's a lot more interesting. Now, it's an extreme example and probably a little bit of a white lie, but just moving things off center and dividing it into thirds, dividing the frame into thirds like this, is really going to help the composition in your photography. And so in this case, you could argue, well, the raft is centered. Well, yeah, but I mean, I didn't really have a choice where the frame, it takes up the entire frame. But you'll notice that interesting things are happening along these lines. And whether or not this was intentional or an accident, frankly, I don't even remember. This was 2 years ago now. But this is part of what makes it interesting, what can help you make a photograph interesting. Obviously, it takes more than just composition rules, but try moving things slightly off center, moving it to a third of the frame or anything like that, and you will be able to improve your photography. And in fact, if you take a look at this photo, what do you notice? All of a sudden, you'll notice that this finger it's approximately centered, but it's also off-centered enough that it's really sort of divided this photo into thirds, really, when you take the entire thing into account. So a photo should, you don't always, of course, rules are meant to be broken. You don't always have to follow this. But if you're unfamiliar with this compositional rule, try it. Just use it a lot and try it and see if it works for you, see if you can get more interesting photos. But also be sure that you can try to achieve some sort of balance in your photos, whether it's compositional balance or even color balance. It really doesn't matter. Don't go with gimmicks too frequently. Like, don't always be off-centering things. Don't always be putting too much of one color in the photo, because eventually that gets a little tiring, frankly. And so if you vary your photos and have some balance in some of them, that will certainly help quite a bit. And certainly when we're talking about the artistic side of photography, a lot of people love to talk about drawing the eye in particular directions. So the first time that you look at a photo, your eye may land somewhere on it, but the photo may draw your eye into a particular direction. So this one isn't the best example, but you may think of, for example, a photo of a tree looking up from the stump of a tree, or from the very base of the tree, for example. That sort of photo is drawing your eye up the tree and towards the top there. So that's just one example of drawing the eye. And so, I mean, there's so many of these rules and all of these other things, but frankly, I think that as long as you try different things, experiment with different things, and begin to develop your own style, which could frankly take years or maybe a shorter amount of time, then that's when you will really start to get into the flow of photography and really start to get a knack for it. Now, the economy being what it is, and luckily it's not as bad as it was a while ago, I'm a little surprised, though not really, that all of you are here, because digital photography is really expensive as a hobby. And if you are in this class because you love digital photography, you want to learn a little bit more about it, well, part of what we are going to be doing, and perhaps more in passing than anything else, is to try to make this more accessible to you. So I mentioned before that one of the things that you shouldn't do is to purchase a digital camera body that's new. And that's especially true if you're going to buy an SLR. I recommend buying a used camera body that is maybe 1 or 2 notches above what you would have bought new. So for example, if you are looking at the Canon line of digital cameras, you might have noticed the Digital Rebel, which is sort of the basic entry-level digital camera into Canon's SLR line. Those are great cameras. They're very good. But I recommend going a few years back, looking on Craigslist or eBay. Of course, be careful whenever you perform transactions on any of these places, or even, I don't know, classified as, wherever you can find this stuff, and look for a few years old cameras. So on the Canon side, because I know the Canon side best, I would recommend the 20D, the 30D, or the 40D. The 50D is too new. You're not going to find a good deal on that, but pretty much any one of those is probably a really good camera to start out with when you're talking about digital photography. And on the Nikon side, the equivalent of those. So those are the 20D through 40D are sort of the mid-range, mid to low range now. Canon is sort of positioning them at the lower range of their line. But still, they have the best bang for your buck in terms of the image quality, the features, and it's basically enough camera for you to grow into. Whereas the Rebel line is definitely a lot more basic. And it's not, of course, to say that the Rebel is inferior of a camera, but it has several features that you may, throughout this semester, find are limiting you in some way, and so that you may grow out of it more quickly than you would one of these mid-range cameras. So my advice is to spend most of your money on lenses, because these lenses are pricey, let me tell you. They are very expensive, and you will want to, you don't want to buy a super nice camera and put a really crappy lens on front of it. You're going to be doing yourself and your camera a disservice. But in terms of lenses, what did I do with that one? I think pretty much required, not for this class, but just in a photographer's toolkit, is this lens here. Both Nikon and Canon have versions of it. It's called a 50mm f1.8, and people love to call it the Nifty 50 because it's one of the cheapest lenses, if not the cheapest. It's fast, which means that it works well in low light. It's very light. It's not heavy at all. It works well when you walk around with it. It's just overall a very solid performing lens on both the Canon and the Nikon side. I will recommend that you get the latest version. The latest version is not that new. It's still several years old. In the Canon side, it's marked with a 2. They love to denote their new versions with Roman numerals. In this case, the modern version is the 2. And that version is updated. It has, I don't know, better optics or something silly like that. But it's worth the $80 to buy that lens and start out with that lens. And generally, lenses that you get with the cameras, so generally you get, along with a camera body, you get what's called a kit lens, which is just a lens that the manufacturer has deemed worthy or whatever of being associated with this camera. Most of the time, I'm going to let you in on a little secret, they're junk. Now, that's especially true on the Canon side. When I bought the 20D, it came with a kit lens, and I tried it, and it was probably the worst lens I'd ever seen. It was really bad. So I sold it right away to some sucker on eBay who bought it, I don't know, $60 or something. It was great. I'm like, yes, pocket some money. But the point is that the difference, it may sound crazy that why would they package that? And the reason is that it's cheap. And people love to look at the specifications of the camera and say, oh, look at how many megapixels it has, or oh, look how fast this is. They don't necessarily look at the specs of the lens. And what you're putting in front of the camera is arguably more important than the camera itself, because that is what is focusing the light, and it is the light that makes your photo. So you need to have, though you don't need to buy very expensive lenses, you do need to have at least, well, you don't even have to, but you should have reasonable quality lenses in front of it. And now, whether this means that you sell the kit lens that comes with it, and I do think the kit lens that comes with the Nikon is considerably better than the one that comes from Canon. So for those of you that purchase Nikon cameras, you might consider a little harder actually keeping the kit lens. I mean, there's a variety of factors that are involved. So this 50mm lens, this is what's called a prime lens. It doesn't zoom. And that may sound like a big deal, but what you get in exchange is how light it is, how cheap it is, and also how bright it is. You can use this in very, very dark areas, and you'll be amazed at the photos you get, especially compared to the kit lens, where the camera, it just is not transmitting as much light. In fact, it's transmitting, let's see, 1, 2, 3, it's probably about 8 times less light, or maybe even less, compared to this lens at the same focal length, at 50mm. And so when I'm talking about these lenses being terrible, that's one of the things, but the other thing is just the optical quality, how good the color is when the light is being transmitted to the camera, how geometrically correct the scene is when it's being transmitted. And we'll look at all of these things in more detail, especially in the optics lecture, but prime lenses in general will do a better job at all of these things than zoom lenses will. You usually have to spend more money on a zoom lens to get the same quality that you can out of a prime lens. Of course, there are exceptions, but in general, that's true. So in general, I would recommend, just to recap, that you purchase used camera bodies and that you focus most of your money on some of the accessories. So the lenses, of course, you're going to need some memory cards. Make sure you have enough memory cards to actually store all of the photos that you take, and good camera cases. So I mentioned this one here. I have another one that I like, and I'll show you in just a minute, just to give you an idea of what I think is reasonable for a camera case. Yes, is there a question?
Is there any downside to image stabilization and also image stabilization built into the camera versus in the lens?
Is there a downside to image stabilization in the camera versus in the lens? There's pros and cons to each. So if the image stabilization, and of course we'll be talking about this in more detail in the optics lecture, if the image stabilization is in the lens, then you only get image stabilization for that one lens. However, generally, that also means that the image stabilization can be tuned to that lens, the optics in that lens, so it could perform a little bit better. So on the one hand, if you get a system such as the Canon or Nikon system where the image stabilization is all in the lens and not in the camera body, you then have to pay for lenses where each one has image stabilization if you want that. On the other hand, we can make the argument that the image stabilization works a lot better on the whole than in the system that only has it in the body. So just like everything else, there's pros and cons. I mean, I can't even say that I would recommend one over the other. I think that other factors are more important when deciding on a camera system, such as price and availability of lenses and a variety of other factors before using that as a way to consider. For example, I think, is it the Sony? Well, there's maybe the Pentax. I forget which. There's some manufacturer that puts image stabilization in the body, which means it's available for all the lenses rather than in the lens itself. Is there another question?
No, it's Sony.
Oh, it is Sony? Oh, okay. All right. So Sony then. So yeah, and Sony, like I mentioned earlier, they do have, they've frankly astounded the world with how cheap some of their full-frame digital cameras are. And that's all well and good, except you'll probably, in the end, pay more for lenses that you would buy on the Canon or Nikon side. So to go back to some of these accessories that I mentioned before, of course, you'll need a good case. You'll probably want to protect your investment. And even though I mentioned before that you don't have to worry too much about it, it's a better idea, or it's a good idea to not have to worry about it when it's stowed in either a case of some kind or what have you. And so I think hard cases are wonderful, but they are, they're pretty limiting because they are hard cases. Other types of cases that I like are from Crumpler. So this one looks pretty big, but this can store a whole bunch of junk. I can tell you this, pretty much everything that you see here except the tripods fit into this case. And it's really nice because I can then carry around a lot of equipment with me, and it doesn't really look like a camera bag, even though on the inside it is definitely designed for photographers. And I think this is in contrast to, for example, Lowepro, which is one of the more popular camera bags, but it looks like a camera bag. And this screams steal me, whereas this looks like, oh, okay, he's a hipster with a messenger bag. I'm not going to steal the lack of money that he obviously doesn't have. So, but the other thing is that Crumpler is very popular with photographers. So if you see somebody else with a Crumpler bag and you yourself are wearing one, you usually get a little nod like that, like, yeah, I know. We're in the club, fist pump and everything. So I mean, this is a recent purchase for me, but I do think that this is a nice bag if you're looking for camera bags, especially compared to some of the other ones that exist. Of course, getting a tripod, one of the best ways before you buy anything else for your camera, one of the first things you should buy is a good tripod. A good tripod will make a huge difference, bigger than just about anything else for the price of admission to it. And you can buy a relatively, so nothing, with the caveat that nothing in photography is cheap. You can buy a relatively inexpensive tripod for about $100 or so. It's good, it's solid, and it has some heft to it. And in fact, every semester, I always love saying that I keep this by my bed because it weighs enough that I would use it as a blunt object if I needed to. But the thing with tripods, just like with everything else, is that it's give and take. So this is a wonderful tripod. It's relatively inexpensive. It supports a lot of weight, but it's heavy. And so then you have to choose between spending a lot of money, getting a lot of stability, or having a very heavy tripod. And I think usually people say you can pick two of the three. So you can either have stability and cost, like this is, or you can have weight and stability like this is, or a variety of other things. Now this tripod, I'm not even going to embarrass myself and tell you how expensive it is, but it is significantly lighter. It is half the weight of that. It's made of carbon fiber and some other things, so it actually is better performing than that, but at half the weight, and it folds. It actually, the reason that I got it is that I can travel with it, and that makes a big difference to me. Last fall, on a whim, I decided to go to London for Thanksgiving. I didn't want to bake a turkey. I was sick of it. So 24 hours before, I bought the tickets, desperately searched for my passport, and then realized that I couldn't fit my tripod into my case. And I said, okay, well, you know what? I don't care. I'll just bring my camera stuff anyway, and I'll see how it goes. And if any of you have been to England at the end of November, you probably know what I'm going to say next, and that it was miserable. It was rainy, it was cloudy, no sunny days, and not one photo that I took did I like. And I was so upset with myself that I got this great deal over there, but I just couldn't take any photos that I wanted to. And so that starts the seed of this is how it always works. When you get into photography, you're like, oh, if I had that one thing, I could have taken all these photos. And so that's when things start to get really expensive for you. And so let me warn you right now, there's two ways to combat that. You either don't take photos or you don't earn an income. Then you won't have to worry about it at all. But anyway, so it is something that you have to watch out for, to not go overboard unless it's something that means that you could always justify something that you must have. But so it's hard for me to figure out how to say that exactly. But be reasonable with these expenditures. But having this tripod, something like this to begin with, where even though it's a little bit heavier, and you still can carry it around, and it really does mean the difference between getting the photo and not getting the photo, especially when we're talking about tripods. In general, I would recommend to stay away from the types of tripods you would find in like Best Buy or something like that. Go to a more reputable camera shop like Calumet, for example, which is near the Cambridge Side Galleria on Bent Street and 1st or 2nd, something around that. And they have a bunch of tripods on display. You can bring your camera, put it on there, and you will instantly feel the difference of how stable it is, how well controlled it is, and a variety of other things. And so, though you don't have to break the bank to buy some fancy carbon fiber tripod, do get a quality tripod. And of course, again, I want to make clear that it's not required for this class, but you will be much happier with the results of your photos if you spend a little bit of money and get something that's quality versus literally a $10 or $20 tripod that comes from Best Buy. And I will warn you that if you do decide to get something from Best Buy and you put a camera, an SLR camera on it, and if the lens has any heft to it at all, so anything other than the 50 millimeter basically, it's going to, usually you have like a little lever here that you screw and tighten to make it stay put. Eventually that's going to strip and it won't support the photo at all, and it will be as if you don't even have a tripod. So usually, as with most things, you pay what you get for, but in the photographic world, you can easily overpay and pay for something that you don't really need. So with all of that said, this is an expensive hobby, yes, but there are quite a few things you can actually do yourself. So tripod, you can try to mimic that if you have a stable surface like a table, for example. Not that sturdy, but you can still put a camera on there and use the timer function or something like that to try to get a more stabilized image. If you have a railing available to you or a concrete wall you can lean on, just anything that's available to you, try to use it as a source for stability. But even, let's see, do I happen to have this page up? Even other things you can do yourself as well. I have this link and I don't remember what it is, so let's see what shows up. One thing that I hope this link is, because then it'll make me look like I have a really good memory, is that eventually if you do some macro photography, for example, you'll notice that one of the difficulties of it, no, All right, that's not what I was looking for. One of the difficulties of macro photography is getting enough light to the subject. When you get really close to it, it becomes too dark. It becomes very hard to get a good photo. And so usually you need a good flash. But you can't just use the flash that's on the camera body, because when you're so close to a subject, your lens is going to sort of block the light that's emitted from your flash. And so they have this really fancy flash technology called a flash ring. And it's basically a ring that hangs around the front of your lens. And it just emits light just right around your lens. And it's great. It's perfect for macro photography. But camera manufacturers, knowing that they can overcharge for this stuff, they do, when you really could make that yourself. And there's a variety of online tutorials that help you make one of these things yourself. And some of these things, whenever we run across something that you can do it yourself that we think is useful, we will in fact put it on the course website under resources. And in fact, in general, I would recommend taking a look at the resources to not only get an idea of some of the resources that are available to you, but also so you can start reading up on specific things that interest you, or I don't know, just to continue your exploration of digital photography. And so with that said, I think I have exhausted myself with all of this excitement. I thank you all for coming. I hope to see you again in 2 weeks. Don't forget, next week is a holiday. And and don't forget, please, to finish these and pass them to the side. Give them to us, please, 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 before you leave, so we know what sections we can make, and we will announce those at the next lecture. Thank you again for coming. We will see you in 2 weeks.